So now that we've finished the Old Testament, I want to talk a little bit about the timeline. Specifically the timeline of the captivity, because there's a lot of issues with it, in my opinion, as the way it is laid out. Now, we're in the Babylonian period. The secular timeline lines up pretty well with the Bible. We're about 3 years off. So the secular timeline has Nebuchadnezzar conquering Jerusalem the first time in 605 BC, but it was really 608 BC, according to the scriptures. And that 3-year discrepancy traces down through most of the Babylonian period. There is some minor discrepancies even in the secular histories, so that this is all okay. This all works out fairly well. We don't need to worry too much about that. But then we come to the Persians. And lining up Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther to Persia, to the secular history, gets a little tricky. Partly because we don't use the same names in the Bible that we have in the secular histories. So when did these people live? Where does these fit in? Well, let's look at the secular timeline first. We start this with Cyrus the Great, the first of the Achaemenid Empire. And it is in 530 that he allows the Jews to return to Jerusalem. We then have his son Cambyses. He's not mentioned in the Bible. This guy, Gautama, is an imposter who tries to take over but is deposed by Darius, who becomes the new king. Darius marries a daughter of Cyrus. His son is Xerxes. Now, it is believed that Esther married Xerxes. Partly, as I've mentioned before, is that the name in Esther, Ahasuerus, is just another translation of the Persian name that is also translated as Xerxes. So this is where most people think Esther fits in. We have his son Artaxerxes the first, which is where most people think Ezra and Nehemiah fit in. Then we have Xerxes II, but he is assassinated within a couple months by Sogdianus. And Sogdianus is then assassinated by Darius, who becomes king. Darius is another son of Artaxerxes. So we have Darius II, then we have his son, Artaxerxes II, Artaxerxes III, and going down. Now, in the Bible, the only names we are given, we have named by name Cyrus. He was prophesied by Isaiah. He lets the Jews return. The next name we have is Darius. Then we have Ahasuerus, which we believe is Xerxes. And then we have Artaxerxes. But here's the problem. In the Bible, when we read in Ezra chapter 4, verses 5 through 7, this is what we read. And they hired counselors against them to frustrate their purpose all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, even unto the reign of Darius, king of Persia, and in the reign of Ahasuerus, which we believe is Xerxes. And then in verse 7, and in the days of Artaxerxes, wrote Bishlam, Mithridates, Tabeel, and the rest of their companions. Then when we go down to the end of this chapter, verses 23 and 24. Now when the copy of King Artaxerxes' letter was read before Rahum and Shimshai, they went up in haste to Jerusalem. Then ceased the work of the house of God, which is at Jerusalem, so it ceased unto the 2nd year of the reign of Darius of Persia. You see our problem here. 2nd year of Darius. And if we read in Ezra chapter 6, verse 15, it is in the 6th year of Darius that the temple is finished. In the 2nd year of Darius, they restart the building, and in the 6th year they finish it. But notice this progression. Cyrus, Darius, Ahasuerus, Artaxerxes, Darius. And then Ezra comes into the story in chapter 8 in the years of Artaxerxes. Now, would not this indicate that Nehemiah and Ezra do not come in the days of Artaxerxes I, son of Xerxes, but rather in the days of Artaxerxes II, the son of Darius II? And if this is the case, if they're coming down at this time, and this is when the temple is built, then the temple is being built in the 6th year of Darius II, which is the year 417. Well, most people consider it to be built in the year of Darius the Great, which would be in the year 516, 100 years earlier. This is a 100-year discrepancy. So, wouldn't this indicate that it did happen much later? That it took, well, they were hindered during the time of Cyrus and Darius, and then during Xerxes, and it was in the year Artaxerxes that the temple stopped. So they're trying to build the temple for nearly 100 years, because they return in 530, And it's in the year of Artaxerxes, around the year 430, that the temple is stopped, that all building is ceased. So they've been trying to build it for 100 years there, and it's always being hindered until finally all construction is stopped. And then we go down to Darius. Now, Xerxes the second, and this Sogdianus guy, they reigned for a couple months each. So between Artaxerxes and Darius the second, we only have a decade or so. And then Darius restarts the building of the temple and is built in 4 years. There are some issues here with putting the temple down here. If the temple is built in the years of Darius II, 100 years after what most people consider it to be built, there's an issue. There's actually two issues. One of all, how did they delay building for over 100 years, or for nearly 100 years, before Artaxerxes gave the decree to stop the building? What were they doing for that 100 years? What kind of construction did he need to stop? That's an issue. That's just a trying to make sense of things issue. But there's another issue that actually puts a real wrench in the works here. And that is because it is stated in Haggai chapter 2 that Zerubbabel laid the foundations of the temple, and he would be there when the temple was finished. The foundations were laid in the days of Cyrus. If the temple is built in the days of Darius II, that's 100 years later. This would put Zerubbabel at 160 years old easily. Does that really work for this timeline? For this time period? Not really. I mean, 110 years is pushing it. That's an old man in this time period. Now, if this was back in the days of Abraham, no problem. But it's not. So that's an issue. However, there is a way to work this out. And that is, in the beginning of Ezra, we actually read that it wasn't under Zerubbabel that they returned the first time. It was under this guy named Shashbazzar. And later on, when the Jews send their letter to Darius, saying Cyrus commanded us to build this, they don't reference Zerubbabel, they reference Shashbazzar. So maybe Zerubbabel wasn't there at the time of Cyrus. Maybe he was there at the time of Darius, and it is stating the prophecy is that you started it in the second year of Darius, and it will be finished while you're alive. And so when it's finished in 4 years, we have a fulfillment of the prophecy. Now, going back to Esther for a minute, I still think Esther would probably marry Xerxes. The reason for that, as I explained in my reading of Esther, is that Mordecai, his genealogy is listed 4 generations back to the captivity. Now, a standard generation we estimate to be about 25 years from father to son, which means about 100 years from the captivity to Mordecai. And that's Mordecai's birth. So we add about another 30, 40 years for the story of Esther to take place. About 140 years after the captivity is when the story of Esther would have taken place. That means the captivity began in 608. Now you could count this to be in 592, I believe, is when Zedekiah is taken captive. The final stage of captivity happens. And either way, though, we could bring it down to about 140 years later, and we get a range of between the years of 470 and 465, approximately, somewhere in there. 470 to 465, maybe to 450, in that area. Xerxes is king from 486 to 465. Works out beautifully. So Esther almost guaranteed married Xerxes. That's when Esther lived. And this also makes sense with Ezra and Nehemiah coming in later, much later, because now the Jews were a very oppressed, persecuted people in the early parts of the empire. Even though they were allowed to return to Jerusalem, there was a lot of intrigue, a lot of stuff going on. But then, under Xerxes, the queen is a Jew. Mordecai, the second most powerful man in the kingdom, is a Jew. So from that point, 60 years later, to have Artaxerxes II, who is a grandson of Artaxerxes I, great-grandson of Xerxes, to have his court have a Jewish cupbearer, and to give great honors to Ezra the scribe. This makes sense that it happens much this later on. It still makes sense with Artaxerxes I, because his mother, or at least his stepmother, is a Jew. So him honoring other Jews would make sense. But it makes a little more sense to me that this kind of is a trickle-down effect, that a few generations later, we have Jews in prominent positions throughout the empire. But this is the timeline. The standard timeline is Esther marries Xerxes, Ezra and Nehemiah come in during the reign of Artaxerxes II. But Ezra seems to contradict this in some ways, and in other ways seems to agree with it. How does it really line up? We just don't know. I tend to think, after reading this and looking at it a little bit more, that it was Darius II who had them build the temple. The temple was finished in the reign of Darius II. And Ezra and Nehemiah actually come in on the scene during the reign of Artaxerxes II, and so they are in the early 300s. Ezra would come to Jerusalem in the year 398, Nehemiah 385. But that is just my thoughts. I can't prove it, but nobody yet can disprove it.